And in my presentation today, I'm going to go over some of the environmental consequences and the economic consequences. I know that for a lot of communities around Ontario, the Green Energy Act has some very practical consequences as you're struggling with whether to proceed with installation of wind turbines, whether to look at getting solar panels installed on properties and so forth. I'm going to take more of a macro view, looking at it in terms of its effect on the overall economy, but I will make a few comments at the end that might have some bearing on decisions at the local level. The Green Energy Act was introduced in 2009. It has the stated goals of reducing conventional air pollution and greenhouse gases, and the mechanism is to replace the coal-fired power plants with renewable sources like wind, solar, biofuels, and small hydro operations. The other goal is to promote economic growth and job creation. And in my report, I'm looking at whether the Green Energy Act has succeeded in achieving these goals. So the three questions that I ask are, will the Green Energy Act materially improve environmental quality in Ontario? Is it a cost-effective plan for accomplishing its goals? And are the economic effects on households and leading economic sectors likely to be positive? My findings, to summarize, are as follows. First of all, it is unlikely the Green Energy Act will yield any environmental improvements beyond those that would have happened anyway. The Green Energy Act, in fact, might actually result in increased air emissions, and I'll explain how that could happen. The most important finding here, though, is that we could have achieved equivalent air quality improvements at a fraction of the cost through another plan that was considered at the same time, or a few years previous to the Green Energy Act, that would have involved a simple retrofit of the existing power plants. The second part of my findings, the approach that was taken under the Green Energy Act is already 10 times costlier than that retrofit option I mentioned, and yet it's only yielded a fraction of the power needed to replace the energy we get from the coal-fired power plants. Wind energy has a particular problem in Ontario because it tends to peak when the system demand is at a minimum, and vice versa. 80% of the power we're getting from wind energy in Ontario comes at a time when we have surplus baseload power already. And so that power needs to be dumped on the export market, and we do that at a significant financial loss. Wind turbines also operate at less than a fifth of their rated capacity about 50% of the time. And as a result, it takes 7 megawatts of new installed wind energy to replace 1 megawatt of coal-fired generating capacity. Finally, the Green Energy Act, in terms of its economic effect, it's already moved Ontario to having some of the highest electricity prices in North America, and experts both within and outside the government are forecasting a further 50% increase in the power rates that people pay. This is not entirely due to things like wind and solar energy. There are also costs associated with maintaining and refurbishing the nuclear plants, but the Green Energy Act is a major driver of those cost increases. The provinces claim that the Green Energy Act will create 50,000 jobs with simply a fabrication. They never had any economic analysis behind it. They've since admitted in their response to the Auditor General's report that they had no factual basis for this claim, and in fact, when they came up with the number, they didn't take into account the job losses in other sectors that will arise due to rising electricity prices. Also, most of those jobs that they refer to would at best be 2 or 3 year construction jobs associated with erecting the turbines, but there are no long-term jobs associated with that. Now, you may be surprised to hear some of that because you've heard a very different story from the province. You've heard that we have air quality problems that are getting worse and worse, and they're killing thousands of people, sending tens of thousands of people to the hospital. And in particular, they pointed to the use of coal-fired power as the source of this problem. And so in the Ontario Ministry of Energy long-term energy plan, there's a paragraph here that talks about our use of coal-fired power in the following terms. Worst of all, Ontario relied heavily on 5 air-polluting coal plants. This wasn't just polluting our air, it was polluting our lungs. Doctors, nurses, and researchers stated categorically that coal generation was having an impact on health, increasing the incidence of various respiratory illnesses. And now they refer to a 2005 study that found that coal was causing $3 billion worth of damages to health and well-being and threatening the lives of children. I'm going to refer back to this 2005 study quite a few times because the province really leans on it whenever they want to defend the Green Energy Act, as they do in this case, as they did in their response to the Auditor General's report. This 2005 study, which I imagine most of you have never seen, it was kept confidential for quite a while after it was released, but it does have some very important information in it for understanding why the Green Energy Act was a misguided effort. If the coal-fired power plants were closed, ozone would be reduced by about 0.08% in Toronto. PM10 would be reduced by about 2% in Toronto. And in 57 locations around the province that the analysis looked at, the numbers would be about the same. The only two locations where there'd be slightly larger reductions would be in the vicinity of the power plants themselves. Now, if that's closing the power plants, if instead we went with the retrofit option, which is maintain them, keep them running, just put some stack gas controls in place at a much lower cost than what we're talking about with replacing them, then we get identical reductions in ozone, reductions again very small, but 0.08%, and a slightly smaller reduction in PM10, 0.8 micrograms per cubic meter as opposed to 1.1 micrograms per cubic meter. Really a difference that would be unmeasurable and unnoticeable. Now, these are the only two air contaminants that were looked at, and that's again because all the other air contaminants, sulfur, carbon monoxide, and so forth, just aren't issues in Ontario. So ozone and PM10 are the only ones that were looked at because they really are the only ones that at this point figure into our air quality index. So the upshot of that analysis is that this report that the province likes to refer to, when we look into the numbers, what it actually said was that yes, you would get a slight improvement in air quality from closing the coal-fired power plants, but it would really be about the same as you would get simply by completing the retrofit that was actually underway at the time the report was published. The retrofit was suspended at that point because the province announced they were going to close the plants. But had they simply completed it, they would have already achieved air quality improvements identical to closing the power plants altogether. And in that scenario, we would get to keep those power plants and continue to make use of them for at least another 20 or 25 years. And that would have quite a few benefits for our power cost situation, as I'll explain. First of all, if you think about the grid that we have a power distribution grid which is geared towards our existing power plants. If we shut those down and replace them with wind facilities, well, the wind facilities are scattered all over the place, all over the province. And so we have to build a grid to accommodate those new wind facilities, and that's going to be very expensive. It also poses a lot of real engineering challenges. It isn't just a matter of running lines out to these wind facilities. It also involves trying to configure the grid to cope with the very different type of power that's generated from wind facilities, this constantly fluctuating up and down and distributed form of power, as opposed to two central locations that generate a very predictable, steady form of electricity. The Auditor General pegs this cost at about $1.5 billion in new transmission lines just to accommodate this change to the grid. Now, in Ontario, we have, as with most places, we have a couple of different types of power generation facilities. One type would go under the heading baseload, and another type would go under the heading of variable or scalable power source. The baseload power just provides a steady, even level of power all through the day, and that's the kind of electricity we get from nuclear plants and hydro generation facilities. And then we use the scalable facilities, like the natural gas and coal-fired power plants, to fill the gap going up and down during the day as system demand goes up and down during the daily cycle. So we have, at this point, a surplus of baseload power in Ontario. This graph that you see here is from the Auditor General's report. It shows the peak electricity demand in Ontario as the black line here. And that's the line showing the daily peak. That's what we need to be able to accommodate on a daily basis. And it amounts to about 25,000 megawatts in Ontario. And It's been declining the last few years. This is where we are now, and it's expected to be roughly constant out to 2025 or so. And so we don't face an immediate need for new generating facilities. The baseload power that we have, the installed capacity of our electricity supply, is given by these green bars here. And so you can see that we have more than enough power generating facilities. What it means is that when we continue to add wind generating facilities to the grid, we're adding to our baseload capacity, and we're adding power there that we don't need. The wind power is unpredictable. When a new wind installation is put in place, it has to be backed up by a natural gas facility that would be rated at about 50% of the power of the wind facility. Because if you have the wind tied into the grid and you're relying on that power, and then the wind direction changes or the wind disappears, you can't just do without the power if you were expecting it. So natural gas facilities need to be running in the background to take up the slack as the wind comes on board or disappears. And so we're adding a combination of wind and gas into a situation where we already have more than enough baseload and scalable power to meet our needs. Now, when the Auditor General began looking at the Green Energy Act, one of the first things that he discovered was that the province hadn't done any analysis of the costs of implementing this act. And the whole thing was rushed through. It was based on very little advanced thought, very little consideration of the effects on households and industry. At this point, the numbers in the Auditor General's report indicate that Ontario is facing increased electricity bills that are costing us about $2.2 billion per year. We also have the global adjustment to our power bills, and the portion, the increase rates that are due to the renewable energy contracts are pegged at $2.7 billion per year. The new transmission facilities will cost about $1.5 billion. So at this point we are looking at costs of about $5 billion per year. And bear in mind, that's not to replace the power from the coal-fired power plants. All we've got so far is a fraction of the power that would be needed to replace the coal-fired power plants. So that's $5 billion per year. What would the retrofit option have cost? That 2005 report pegs it at $817 million per year. So we are currently looking at $5 billion per year as opposed to $817 million per year to go the green energy path route. Now, Lambton and Nanticoke have 7,500 megawatts of capacity between them. Wind only operates on average at 30% capacity. It's a high of 41% on average in November. Demand is very low in Ontario, or relatively low. We have our peak energy demand in July. It's very hot, people have their air conditioning on, and that's when we get the minimum of wind energy. We get 14% of the rated capacity on average in the month of July. So in order to get 1 megawatt of year-round power from wind energy, you need to install 7 megawatts of new wind capacity. So if the province goes ahead and really achieves 4,800 megawatts of capacity, that doesn't mean they need to install 4,800 megawatts of wind energy. They need to install 7 times that in order to have year-round 4,800 megawatts. And so at this point, the cost of the wind-related programs in the Green Energy Act are about $4 billion, and that gives us, at present, only 10% of the planned wind capacity that the province says we eventually are going to hit. So, putting it all together, on a scaled comparison to the retrofit option, the Green Energy Act is currently costing us about 10 times as much as what we would have spent if we'd simply gone with the retrofit plus the greenhouse gas offset option. If we actually go to the level of green energy, and in particular of wind energy, that the province says they want to get to, in other words, replacing 4,800 megawatts of generating capacity on a year-round basis with wind energy, it will take us up to 73 times the cost of the retrofit option. And what do we get for that in terms of environmental benefit? We get no environmental benefit that we would not have had with the retrofit option. So I'm comparing apples and apples here. I'm comparing two plans that would yield the same environmental benefit, and one of them, if we actually pursue it as the province intends, will be 73 times the cost of the other. Now, things get even worse when we look at this timing mismatch. The Green Energy Act mandates that the grid operator has to buy all the available wind power at 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour from wind turbine operators. 80% of that power comes at times when we already have surplus baseload, and we dump it on the export market. The wholesale price on the export market is typically 4 cents per kilowatt hour or less. So we're buying power at 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour, selling it at 4 cents per kilowatt hour. We are losing $24,000 per hour that wind turbines operate in this province. So a lot of people listening to this presentation will have an annual income of about $48,000 or less. That means that all the work that you do for an entire year is just enough to pay for 2 hours of losses from our wind grid. We are losing about $200 million per year just on this aspect of the Green Energy Act. Now, scaling up to the macroeconomy and where this is all taking us. Ontario used to have some of the cheapest electricity rates in North America. That was one of the ways that we built a manufacturing sector in the province, by being able to offer to large-scale manufacturing operations very inexpensive electricity from our mix of hydro, nuclear, and some fossil energy. We've thrown that comparative advantage out the window. We're now among the most expensive sources, or we now have electricity prices that are near the top of the list. And we have not even finished with the electricity price increases. As I mentioned, the Auditor General and also private sector forecasters that have analyzed the provincial government's plans say we're in for another 40 to 50% increases across the board for all our power user groups. At the same time, in the United States, electricity prices are declining because of the shale gas revolution and a few other changes that are happening to their electricity grid. So their electricity prices are going down while we're on an upward trajectory. And the province, in recognizing this, they are trying to shield some of the large industrial users by promising a new subsidy program for them. There are lots of strings attached. The firms need to spend money on hiring that they wouldn't otherwise do, so it's not necessarily going to save them money. But the bigger problem here is all that does is it transfers the cost onto taxpayers. So taxpayers, or in other words households, that are already dealing with their own reduced budgets because their own household power costs have gone up, will also be footing the bill to pay for the subsidies for industrial groups, which the province is proposing as a way of trying to patch up a problem that they created with the Green Energy Act. So it's no solution, and it's not really plausible that a province that's running a deficit of the size that we're now facing can commit to these long-term subsidy programs. Certainly the green energy benefit for Ontario households that only partly covers the cost of the rising energy bills that we're facing, that's scheduled to be eliminated at the end of 2014. And so subsidy programs really are not a solution to the underlying problem that we're facing, this trajectory of rapidly increasing electricity prices in a context where North American electricity prices should be going down, and they are going down in a lot of jurisdictions that we compete with for manufacturing activity. Now, there's a related issue here which I don't touch on in the report, and that is the question of lost property values, the health effects of wind energy, the concerns at the local level that people have of what happens when the turbines appear. And this is something that it's difficult to quantify. We know from talking to people in real estate appraisal and who look at these kinds of issues that yes, property values are taking a hit in some areas due to the wind turbines. Where this is really going to play out, though, is in the courts. And here there are a lot of lawsuits that are pending because wind farms in the vicinity of a residential area may interfere with the customary rights for landowners to use and enjoy their property. And so wind farms may be deemed a form of nuisance. If they are seen to inflict damages in the form of reduced property values and negative health effects, then the courts may be called upon to assess liability. On April 22nd, there was an important decision from the Ontario Superior Court of Justice that although they didn't authorize proceeding with a lawsuit in one particular case, it was only because the project in question hasn't been approved yet. And the ruling, though, was they accepted the evidence that if the project goes ahead, there could be property value losses between 22 and 50% in the surrounding areas. The court also accepted evidence that if the project goes ahead, there will be negative health consequences for people living in the vicinity. And so they authorized the suit to go ahead if and when the project is actually approved. So the project doesn't even have to be built. It just has to be approved. And at that point, the court recognizes that right away there's a loss of property values. So, to summarize, to finish up here, in addition to the issue of lost property values and the health costs of wind turbines, the Green Energy Act at the more macro level is going to drive down the rate of return to capital in mining and manufacturing, and that's going to lead to reduced investment and employment in the province. The province did not have an air pollution problem in 2009 that would have required intervention in the form of the Green Energy Act, and even if they had wanted to achieve some air quality improvements related to power plant operations, a relatively low-cost retrofit option was available that would have yielded pretty much the same benefits throughout the province at a fraction of the cost. We have a problem with wind energy in Ontario that because of the seasonal fluctuations, it takes 7 megawatts of wind to replace 1 megawatt of coal-fired power plant. As a result, if the province really does intend to hit that 4,800 megawatt capacity, it's going to make the Green Energy Act 73 times as costly as the retrofit option would have been. We are dumping most of our current wind energy on the export market because it comes into the grid at a time when it's not needed, and that's currently costing us about $200 million annually. You can think of that as the budget of either a small university or a relatively large hospital. Just think, we could build and operate a large hospital in the province for the amount that we are spending just to purchase wind energy that we don't need, that we turn around and dump on the export market. That is money that is just pure loss. There's absolutely no gain associated with it. And this has all put us on a trajectory towards the higher electricity prices that you are seeing each month on your energy bill.